The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Jefferson Middle School, casting long, golden streaks across the polished floors as the first bell pierced the air. The hallways buzzed with the vibrant chaos of a new school day, students laughing, lockers slamming shut, and sneakers squeaking against the tiles. Amid the lively throng, Marcus Washington moved with a quiet assurance that belied his 12 years. His small frame carried a tattered notebook pressed tightly to his chest, its worn edges a testament to countless hours of doodling superheroes and scribbling dreams. A wide grin stretched across his face, lighting up his dark eyes with a spark that drew people in like moths to a flame. Marcus was no ordinary kid. He had a magnetic charm, a boundless energy that could brighten the gloomiest corners of any room. Teachers adored his sharp mind, classmates admired his easy humor, and deep down, he harbored ambitions far bigger than the modest halls of his school could contain. He was a dream-era boy who lived for comic books, the thump of a basketball on asphalt, and the proud gleam in his father's eyes. That father, David Washington, was Marcus's North Star, a towering figure with a steady gaze and a voice that could command a room. Without ever rising to a shout, David was the chief of police in their bustling city. He'd clawed his way to that position through grit and unrelenting determination, carrying the weight of his badge like a sacred vow. For David, it wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a promise etched into his soul to safeguard every soul in his community, no matter their skin tone or station in life. As one of the few black chiefs in the country, he knew the stakes were higher for him, the scrutiny sharper, the margin for error non-existent. Yet beyond the precinct's walls, David's truest pride lay in being Marcus's father. He was the kind of dad who never missed a chance to cheer from the bleachers, who showed up to every parent-teacher meeting with a notepad of his own, and who knelt beside Marcus at night to remind him that the world was his to conquer. Their connection was a fortress, built brick by brick through years of quiet talks, shared laughter, and an unspoken trust that nothing could fracture. But that morning, as Marcus navigated the crowded hallway, the air shifted, thickened with a sudden, suffocating tension. A voice, harsh and booming like a clap of thunder, sliced through the chatter. Get against the wall. Every head turned, eyes wide, as a uniformed officer loomed into view. His broad shoulders filled the space, his hand hovering menacingly near the holster at his hip. The clamor of the hallway dissolved into a stunned silence, the only sound the faint echo of his command bouncing off the lockers. Marcus froze mid-step, his small hands tightening around his notebook until his knuckles paled. His heart thudded in his chest, a frantic rhythm he couldn't control. As confusion flooded his mind, what had he done? His wide eyes darted around, searching the sea of faces for an answer. But all he found was fear mirrored back at him. He was just a boy barely 12, small for his age, his frame dwarfed by the officer's imposing shadow. But in that moment, he felt smaller still, a speck caught in a storm he didn't understand. Hands on the wall. Now, the officer barked again, his voice dripping with venom as he closed the distance between them. His boots struck the floor with deliberate force, each step a declaration of dominance. Marcus's breath hitched, his skinny legs trembling beneath him. "But I didn't do anything," he stammered, his voice so soft it barely broke the silence, each word snagging in his throat like a plea swallowed by panic. He glanced around again, desperate for someone to step forward to tell him this was a mistake. The crowd of students and teachers stared back, their faces a gallery of shock and helplessness. No one moved, no one spoke. The officer's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "Don't talk back to me, kid," he snapped, lunging forward. His meaty hand clamped onto Marcus's arm with bruising force, yanking him around and slamming him against the cold steel of the lockers. A sharp gasp escaped Marcus as his cheek met the unyielding metal, the chill seeping into his skin like a brand. From the edge of the gathering crowd, a voice cut through the heavy air, firm, urgent, trembling with barely restrained fury. "What are you doing to him? That's my son." David Washington stepped forward, his plain cloth faded jacket and John's doing little to hint at the authority he carried. His hands shook, not from fear but from a molten rage simmering just beneath his calm exterior. His eyes locked onto Marcus, whose tear-streaked face turned toward him, silently begging for rescue. The officer barely spared David a glance, his sneer deepening as he waved a dismissive hand. "Stay back," he growled, his tone laced with contempt. "I don't care who you are. This one's acting suspicious." Suspicious, the word landed like a slap, and David's chest tightened as he took another step forward, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and disbelief. "Suspicious? He's 12 years old. He's a student here. Let him go." His gaze never left Marcus, whose small frame quaked under the officer's grip. His notebook now crumpled on the floor like a fallen shield. "I'm doing my job," the officer hissed, tightening his hold on Marcus's arm until the boy whimpered, a sound that shattered David's composure like glass. "Kids like this think they can get away with anything. Not on my watch." The phrase hung in the air, sharp and loaded, and David's blood ran cold. "Kids like this," he demanded, his voice rising as he closed the gap between them. "What's that supposed to mean?" The officer didn't flinch, a twisted smirk curling his lips as he met David's glare head-on. "It means exactly what it sounds like. I know trouble when I see it." Trouble. The word burrowed into David's soul, unearthing a wound he'd spent his life trying to outrun. He knew what this Wasavrian in that hallway did. This wasn't about suspicion. It was about the color of Marcus's skin. The assumptions etched into the officer's mind, the power he wielded like a club. To him, Marcus wasn't a child, a student. A dream mirror was a target, a scapegoat for a prejudice so ingrained it blinded him to reason. "Let him go, now," David said, his voice dropping to a low, steady command that vibrated with authority. But the officer didn't relent. Instead, he shoved Marcus harder against the lockers, as if to prove a point, to flex his control over the helpless boy. Marcus cried out, his voice breaking into a sob. "Dad, please help me." A whisper so faint it barely reached the air, yet it stabbed into David's chest like a blade. His heart pounded, a deafening drumbeat in his ears, as he shouted again, "Let him go." The crowd stirred now, a ripple of murmurs spreading like wildfire, whispers of outrage, gasps of disbelief. A few students fumbled with their phones, their trembling hands struggling to capture the unfolding nightmare, the scene unfolding frame by horrifying frame. But the officer ignored them all, his focus locked on David. "You think you're somebody," he spat, his tone mocking, venomous. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" "I'm his father," David shot back, his voice a razor's edge, cutting through the tension. "And I'm telling you to let my son go before you regret this." The officer laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Regret it? I don't take orders from you or anyone else. I'm the law here." David's jaw clenched, his lips a tight line as he stared at the man who dared to treat his son like dirt, like less than human. For a moment, he was silent, his eyes blazing with a fury he could barely contain. Every pair of eyes in the hallway bore into him, every breath held in anticipation. Then, in a voice sharp and clear as a gunshot, he said, "You have no idea who you're talking to." The officer's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Before he could respond, the heavy thud of boots reverberated down the corridor. Uniformed officerial ones, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent light, stormed into the scene, their expressions a mix of shock and urgency as they took in the tableau. A boy pinned against the lockers, a father trembling with rage, and a rogue cop standing defiant. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded, his voice sharp as his eyes flit between the trio. David stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of calm, though his gaze burned with lethal intensity. "I'm the chief of police," he said, his words steady but laced with a quiet menace. "And this man just assaulted my son." The hallway exploded into choice gasps, murmurs, a tidal wave of realization crashing over the crowd. The officer's face drained of color, his mouth gaping like a stranded fish as he stumbled back, releasing Marcus as if the boy's skin had scorched him. "You're," he stammered, the truth dawning too late, a tidal wave of dread washing over him. He'd miscalculated the fallacy, the consequences loomed like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Marcus sank to the floor, clutching his bruised arm, his tearful eyes finding his father's as David rushed to his side, pulling him into a fierce embrace. The other officers moved in, their hands firm on the rogue cop's shoulders, his bravado crumbling into dust. What followed shook the community to its core. The officer, once so untouchable in his arrogance, faced a reckoning that stripped away every illusion of power he'd clung to. His actions laid bare not just his own corruption, but a festering rot within the system he'd believed would shield him. Justice, when it came, was swift and unflinching, a mirror held up to his abuse of authority, reflecting the consequences of wielding power without conscience. For David, it was a bitter triumph, a reminder that even those tasked with upholding the law could twist it into a weapon. For Marcus, it was a scar, a lesson in a world that could judge him before knowing him. And for the community, it was a clarion call that true justice demands accountability, that the fall of the mighty begins when the powerless rise. In a modest home nestled within a neighborhood that teetered on the edge of hardship, yet brimmed with the warmth of tight-knit souls, David Washington and his son Marcus carved out a life defined by resilience and quiet dignity. The house wasn't grand, its paint chipped at the corners and its furniture worn from years of use, but it radiated comfort, a sanctuary forged through David's relentless efforts to provide stability. After the unbearable loss of his wife 5 years prior, her absence lingered like a shadow, softening over time but never fully fading. And David had poured every ounce of himself into raising Marcus, determined to shield him from the chaos that grief could unleash. It hadn't been a smooth road, nights spent wrestling with bills, days stretching long with exhaustion, but together they'd found a rhythm, a steady heartbeat to their little family of two. Saturdays unfolded with the thud of a basketball against cracked pavement at the park, the flicker of old movie reels on their second-hand TV, and conversations that danced between Marcus's schoolyard tales and the weightier questions life whispered in their ears. To Marcus, his father stood as a towering figure of strength, a hero whose calloused hands and steady gaze promised safety. To David, Marcus was a living testament to everything he'd fought for, a bright spark of pride that lit up even his darkest days. On this particular morning, the air around Marcus buzzed with an electric thrill as he stepped into the bustling halls of his middle school. His science teacher had just unveiled a competition, a chance to shine, and Marcus's mind raced with possibility-formed sketches of circuits and wild dreams of a project that could claim first place. He could already picture the moment he'd spill it all to his dad over dinner, the way David's eyes would light up with that familiar mix of curiosity and encouragement. As he weaved through the crowded corridor toward his locker, his laughter rang out, bright and unrestrained, mingling with the chatter of friends he greeted with quick fist bumps and playful jabs. The day felt ordinary, wrapped in the comforting hum of routine, but beneath its surface, unseen forces were stirring, threads of a darker story, beginning to knot together in ways no one could yet fathom. Outside, Officer Greg Harper slouched against his patrol car, the chipped paint of the vehicle mirroring the weariness etched into his face. He sipped his coffee, the steam curling into the crisp morning air, and watched the stream of students with a gaze that carried more disdain than duty. Assigned to the school as part of a community outreach program, Harper saw the role as a slap in the face, a humiliating downgrade masquerading as purpose. On the force, his name drifted through hushed conversations, a reputation built on sharp edges and shadowed decisions no one dared challenge outright. He was a man who wore his uniform like armor, but beneath it simmered a bitterness that had long since hardened into something ugly, a conviction that respect wasn't a gift to be offered, but a prize to be seized. His eyes tracked the kids filing past, narrowing as they settled on Marcus, whose easy stride and wide grin seemed to pierce Harper like a personal affront. To him, Marcus embodied everything he loathed, a boy who moved through the world with a confidence that felt defiant, as if the rules were mere suggestions he could sidestep. It was a baseless grudge, a spark of resentment fanned by nothing more than Harper's own warped lens. But it took root all the same, festering in the quiet of his mind. Inside, Marcus stood at his locker, tugging books free with a hum on his lips, when he caught sight of Harper stepping through the school's double doors. The officer's presence wasn't new, often roamed the halls during the morning rush, a stern figure in blue cutting through the chaos. But today, something felt off. Harper's jaw was set, his movements deliberate. each step echoing with intent as he scanned the crowd. Marcus's fingers tightened around his notebook, the one stuffed with doodles and brainstorming scraps for his science project. As Harper's shadow loomed closer, when their paths collided, Harper halted, his bulk casting a chill over the boy. Marcus lifted his eyes, startled but composed, and offered a polite, "Good morning, Officer Harper." His voice steadied despite the sudden knot in his chest. Harper didn't reply. His stare dropped to the notebook clutched in Marcus's hands, and his lips twitched into a thin, accusing line. "What's in there?" he demanded, his tone slicing through the air like a blade. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Just my schoolwork," he said, confusion threading through his words. Harper leaned in, his breath sharp with coffee and menace. "Don't play smart with me, kid. I know your type think you can slip by because nobody's watching. Well, I'm watching." Marcus's stomach twisted, a cold wave of unease washing over him. He darted a glance around, silently pleading for Semyony and Yodo Stepan, but the hallway had fallen into a tense hush. Students clutched their backpacks tighter. Teachers lingered at classroom doors, their faces etched with uncertainty. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Marcus managed, his voice quivering now as fear crept in. "I'm just going to class," but Harper wasn't hearing him. With a sudden lunge, he seized Marcus's arm, yanking him toward the lockers, hands on the wall. He barked, his grip bruising as he pressed Marcus's cheek against the cold metal. "Let's see if you're hiding anything." Whispers rippled through the growing cluster of onlookers, a static hum of shock and disbelief. Marcus's heart hammered, his breath shallow as humiliation burned through him. He hadn't done a thing to deserve this, and yet here he was, pinned like a suspect, his peers' eyes boring into him. The commotion reached David just as he stepped into the school for a scheduled meeting with the principal. He'd been rehearsing what he'd say about Marcus's progress, pride swelling in his chest, when the sight ahead stopped him cold. His son, his boy, shoved against a locker by a man in uniform. Rage surged through him, a molten tide that drowned every rational thought. He shoved through the crowd, his voice a thunderclap splitting the silence. "What the hell is going on here?" Harper barely flinched, his hold on Marcus unrelenting as he tossed a dismissive, "Step back, sir," over his shoulder, not even sparing David a glance. David's voice rose, sharp and unshakable. "That's my son. Let him go." Harper's grip tightened instead, a sneer curling his lips. "Your son? Huh, figures." Troubles written all over him. David's fists clenched, his knuckles whitening as he took a step closer, every muscle coiled with restraint. "I'm warning you," he growled, low and lethal. "Release him now." The air thickened, heavy with the weight of their standoff, every onlooker holding their breath as the clash teetered on the edge of something irreversible. Harper's bravado flickered, a crack in his armor, but the damage was already carved deep in injustice that would ripple outward, shaking the ground beneath them all. Later, in the principal's office, the silence pressed down like a physical force, unnatural and suffocating. David sat rigid, his jaw locked tight, his hands balled into fists on his knees as if anchoring himself against the storm raging inside. Beside him, Marcus slumped in his chair, his face drained of color, his gaze glued to the scuffed linoleum floor. The boy hadn't spoken much since the hallway, his usual spark dimmed to a flicker, replaced by a quiet that screamed louder than any protest. It wasn't just fear trembling in his small framite was a wound, raw and unnameable, the kind no 12-year-old should ever carry. Across the desk, Principal Evans, a weary man with thinning hair and a perpetually uneasy expression, fidgeted with his tie, his throat clearing in a nervous rasp. "Chief Washington," he started, his words measured as if tiptoeing through a minefield. "I want to assure you the school doesn't condone what happened today." David's eyes snapped to him, piercing and unyielding. "Condone?" he echoed, his voice a low rumble laced with fury. "That's all you've got? My son was humiliate us all tent in front of everyone, and you think saying you don't condone it fixes anything?" Evans squirmed, his gaze flitting to Marcus and back, discomfort radiating from him. "I understand your anger, Chief, I do. Officer Harper was out of line, and we'll investigate, but what?" David cut in, his tone rising just enough to make the man flinch. "What excuse are you about to spit out? That he was doing his job? that this was some mix-up. Evans faltered, then let out a heavy sigh. I'm not excusing it. I'm trying to handle this carefully. Harper's been here a year, respected by some staff, respected by who? David shot back, leaning forward, his voice a dangerous whisper. The same people who stood by while he attacked my son. Marcus shifted beside him, his hands gripping the chair's edge until his knuckles paled, his shoulders quaking faintly. David noticed, his heart twisting, and he rested a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. It's okay, son, he murmured, his tone softening for just a moment. We'll get through this. Evans cleared his throat again, scrambling to reclaim control. Chief, disciplinary action will be taken. Harper's on temporary leave pending investigation. Temporary leave, David repeated, disbelief dripping from every syllable. He leaned back, eyes narrowing to slits. That's not enough. Not even close. The door creaked open then, a subtle interruption to the charged silence, and the weight of what lay ahead settled over them all. What had begun as a single act of overreach was spiraling into something bigger, a reckoning that would peel back layers of truth and consequence. Justice, David knew, wasn't just a word, it was a fight, one he'd wage with every breath for his son. A fight that would expose the cost of power wielded without restraint and leave an indelible mark on their fractured community. The sharp, rhythmic clack of heels echoed through the room as a woman stepped inside, her tailored suit pristine and her posture radiating authority. It was Sarah James, the school district's legal counsel, a figure whose very presence seemed to tighten the already strained air. In one hand, she clutched a thick folder, its edges worn from use, while her face carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to navigating tense situations. Yet, beneath that polished exterior, her eyes betrayed here a flicker of unease dance there. Subtle but unmistakable, she cleared her throat, her voice steady and deliberate as she addressed the room. Chief Washington, she began, her tone carefully measured. I know this is an incredibly challenging moment for you. I want you to know we're treating this with the utmost seriousness. David Washington didn't even glance her way. His gaze remained locked on his son, Marcus, who sat slumped in a chair, his small frame swallowed by the oversized furniture. The boy hadn't uttered a word since they'd arrived, his silence a heavy weight in the room. David's voice cut through the stillness, low and controlled, but laced with a simmering fury he could barely restrain. You all keep repeating the same tired lines, he said, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. You're taking it seriously. You condemn what happened, but those are just word-shallow, meaningless words if nothing actually changes. His eyes stayed on Marcus, taking in the way his son's hands fidgeted nervously in his lap, the way his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Sarah set the folder down on the desk with a soft thud, folding her hands in front of her as if to steady herself. We're conducting a thorough investigation into Officer Harper's actions, she replied, her voice calm but firm. Depending on what we find, there could be serious consequence to tension, even as she paused, choosing her next words with care. Or what? David snapped, his head whipping around to face her at last. His eyes blazed with a fury that made Sarah flinch, though she quickly masked it. A slap on the wrist, a quiet transfer to another school where he can do it all over again. That man doesn't deserve to wear a badge, let alone be anywhere near children. His voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of his conviction. He towered over the room as he rose to his feet, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the dim light. Sarah hesitated, her composure faltering for a split second. She took a breath, steadying herself before responding. Chief, I understand how frustrating this must be for you, but there are protocols we're bound to follow. Due process must be upheld. Her words were meant to soothe, but they landed like gasoline on an open flame. David's laugh was bitter, a sharp bark that echoed off the walls. Due process, he said, his voice rising as he took a step toward her. Don't you dare lecture me about due process. I've spent over 2 decades in law enforcement. I know the system inside and out better than you ever will. And I know exactly how it shields people like Harper while failing the ones it's supposed to protect. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening. My son deserves more than this. All these kids do. Sarah opened her mouth to reply, but David wasn't done. He turned sharply to the principal, a weary man with thinning hair who sat hunched at the far end of the desk, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And you," David said, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "Do you have any idea what it felt like, standing there, helpless, watching my son, me 12-year-old son, being treated like some kind of criminal? Watching that man shove him against a locker, his hands on him, while you just stood there, frozen, doing nothing?" The principal's head jerked up, his face crumpling under the weight of David's words. His lips parted, and his voice came out small, shaky. "Didn't know what to do," he admitted, his hands twisting together in his lap. "It all happened so fast." "That's the problem," David shot back, his tone heavy with a mix of exhaustion and disgust. "None of you knew what to do, so you did nothing. And my boy paid the price." The room fell into a suffocating silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Marcus finally lifted his head, his dark eyes shimmering with tears he refused to let fall. "Dad," he whispered, his voice so soft it barely carried across the room, "can we go home?" The sound of his son's voicemail, fragile, pleading, pierced David's heart like a shard of glass. His anger softened, replaced by an ache so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. He nodded, stepping closer to Marcus and resting a steady hand on his shoulder. "Yeah, son," he said gently, his tone a stark contrast to the fire he'd unleashed moments before. "Let's go." As they walked out of the office, the air seemed to thicken with the weight of what had just transpired. David's broad frame moved with purpose, but his mind churned with a storm of emotions: rage, guilt, determination. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The system he'd dedicated his life to upholding had betrayed his son, and that betrayal burned in his chest like a live coal. He wouldn't let it go now, not ever. In the car, the hum of the engine filled the silence between them until Marcus spoke again, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and pain. "Why did he do it, Dad? Why did he hate me so much?" The question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, a child's desperate attempt to make sense of cruelty. David's hands tightened around the steering wheel, the leather creaking under his grip. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing himself to stay calm for his son's sake. "It wasn't about you, Marcus," he said, his voice low and steady. "It was about him, his ignorance, his fear, his need to feel powerful. But I promise you, he's going to answer for what he did." Marcus nodded, but the hurt in his eyes lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. David knew that wound would take time to heal, if it ever did. But he also saw the quiet strength in his son, a resilience that mirrored his own. As they drove home through the darkening streets, David's mind raced. He thought about the years he'd spent fighting for justice, the late nights and endless battles to earn the trust of his community. All of it had crumbled in a single, brutal moment, shattered by the image of Officer Harper pinning Marcus against those cold metal lockers, a smirk twisting his lips as if he enjoyed it. David's stomach churned at the memory, his anger flaring anew. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about every child who'd ever been made to feel small, every parent who'd stood by powerless as their world fell apart. He didn't just want Harper held accountable, wanted the whole rotten system to change. And he knew that fight would demand everything he had. When they pulled into the driveway, Marcus turned to his father, his voice quiet but firm. "You won't let him get away with it, will you?" His eyes searched David's face, seeking reassurance, a lifeline in the chaos. David met his son's gaze, his own eyes burning with resolve. "Not a chance," he said, his voice solid as steel. Inside, the house was still, but it wasn't the familiar peace of home. It was the tense, electric quiet that precedes a storm. Long after Marcus had gone to bed, David sat at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across his face. His mind churned with plans, strategies, possibilities. The road ahead would be grueling, a battle against a system that had shielded men like Harper for far too long. But he was ready. This was about justice, about standing up to power and demanding better, not just for Marcus, but for everyone it had failed. Days later, the conference room at police headquarters buzzed with restless energy. Officers lined the long table, their uniforms crisp, but their faces etched with unease. The usual banter and camaraderie had evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension that hung over the room like a storm cloud. At the head of the table sat David Washington, his presence a quiet force, radiating authority even as a tempest brewed beneath his calm exterior. His eyes swept the room, lingering on each officer, reading their expressions, some nervous, some defiant, others simply exhausted. He said nothing at first, letting the weight of his silence fill the space. Across from him sat Greg Harper, his posture rigid, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He hadn't spoken since he'd slunk into the room, but his body screamed defiance. His jaw was set, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes glinted with a mix of resentment and arrogance. To Harper, this meeting was a farcy and overblown reaction from an angry father, nothing more. He'd been through reprimands before. They'd always ended with a warning, a shuffle to a new post, and business as usual. He didn't yet grasp the gravity of what was unfolding. David's voice finally broke the silence, deep and resonant, carrying an edge that made the room still. "Before we start, I need you all to understand something," he said, his gaze steady. "This isn't just about what happened to my son. This is about accountability. It's about what kind of department we're going to be, whether we protect our own no matter what, or whether we stand for something bigger." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Some officers shifted in their seats, exchanging wary glances. Others stared straight ahead. Unwilling to meet his eyes, Harper stayed silent, but a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. David leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the table, his voice dropping to a measured intensity. "Officer Harper," he said, fixing his gaze on the man across from him, "do you have anything to say about what happened at Jefferson Middle School?" Harper uncrossed his arms and leaned back, his chair creaking under the shift. He met David's stare with a look of casual annoyance, as if this were all beneath him. "I was doing my job," he said flatly, his tone dripping with indifference. "That's what this is about, right? Me doing my job, and someone not liking how I did it." David's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained eerily calm. "Doing your job," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge. "Tell me, then, what part of your job involves pinning a 12-year-old boy against a locker and accusing him of something he didn't do?" His tone was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Harper's bravado falter, if only for a moment. Harper shrugged, his nonchalance a deliberate provocation. "The kid was acting suspicious," he said. His voice clipped. "I followed protocol. That's it." "Suspicious," David echoed, drawing the word out slowly, his tone sharpening. "What exactly did he do that was so suspicious?" His hands pressed harder against the table, his restraint visibly fraying. Harper hesitated, his confidence flickering as he scrambled for an answer. He was lingering around, watching people, he said, his words stumbling slightly. He had that note, a book, he didn't know what was in it. "Could have been anything. Could have been anything," David repeated, his voice rising just enough to make Harper shift uncomfortably. He leaned back, his eyes boring into the officer with a mix of disbelief and disgust. "So you're telling me you decided to detain a child because—" He was standing in a hallway with a notebook. The room grew deathly quiet, the tension so thick it felt like it might snap. Before Harper could respond, the door swung open and Sarah James stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She carried a thick folder under her arm, her face composed but her eyes weary from long hours of digging through reports. She gave David a brief nod before settling into a chair, her voice brisk as she spoke. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting the folder down with a thud that seemed to punctuate the moment. David's gaze flicked to her, then back to Harper. The storm inside him was building, but he held it in check for now. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served, not just for Marcus, but for every soul the system had let down. The lesson was clear: power unchecked breeds corruption, and the consequences of that corruption ripple far beyond a single moment. David would make sure those ripples became a tidal wave. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, as Sarah James stood with her shoulders squared, her voice slicing through the tension like a cold wind over a frozen lake. "I've been poring over every statement from the witnesses at the school, Chief Washington. she said, her tone sharp and deliberate, each word landing with purpose. "And I think you're going to want to hear this." She clutched a manila folder in her hands, its edges worn from repeated handling, a silent testament to the hours she'd spent unraveling the truth. David Washington, seated at the head of the long, scratched conference table, gave a slight nod. His deep brown eyes locked onto her. They were steady, unyielding, but beneath that calm exterior, a storm brewed danger, resolve, and something softer, more fragile, that he kept buried deep. He gestured for her to go on, his large hand cutting through the air with quiet authority, urging her to lay bare the facts. Sarah opened the folder with a slow, deliberate motion, the rustle of paper amplifying the stillness that had settled over the group. Her voice grew colder, more precise, as she began to read. Multiple students and staff members, teachers, janitors. Even the lunch lady confirmed that Marcus Washington wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. Before Officer Harper approached him, he was just a kid going about his day. The security cameras back it up, too. You can see him walking down the hall toward his locker, his backpack slung over one shoulder, laughing with a couple of friends. Typical teenage stuff. He wasn't sneaking around, wasn't causing trouble, wasn't even raising his voice. He was just existing. She paused, letting the weight of that simplicity sink in, her green eyes flicking up to meet the gazes of the others in the room. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, like a fog rolling in off the coast, cloaking everything in a gray haze of unspoken truths. Officer Harper shifted in his seat, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. His uniform, usually a source of pride, seemed to hang on him now, the badge on his chest glinting faintly in the fluorescent light. His fingers twitched nervously at his sides, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He didn't say a word, but his discomfort was palpable, radiating off him like heat from a radiator. Sarah pressed on, her voice dropping lower, edged with a quiet fury she could barely contain. "What's more, the footage shows Officer Harper trailing Marcus for a good 5 minutes before he decided to confront him. 5 minutes of shadowing a kid through the crowded hallways, past the chipped blue lockers and the bulletin boards plastered with flyers for the spring dance. Marcus didn't duck into a corner, didn't glance over his shoulder suspiciously, didn't give Harper a single reason to zero in on him. And yet, there Harper was, stalking him like a hunter tracking prey. David's voice broke through the stillness, calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made the air itself feel sharper. "Care to explain that, Officer Harper?" His words were measured, deliberate, but they hit like a punch to the gut. Harper's face flushed a deep crimson, the color creeping up his neck and staining his ears. The bravado he'd worn earlier, like armor he'd polished for years, scrambled away, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. "I was just being cautious," he stammered, his voice cracking under the strain. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his fingers trembling slightly. "You never know what kids like him might be up to." The room froze, time itself seeming to halt as those words hung in the air, ugly and raw, their meaning unmistakable. The unspoken prejudice in his statement was a dark stain spreading across the table, and no one could look away from it. David's expression didn't shift, his chiseled features carved from stone, but the fire in his eyes flared brighter, a quiet inferno blazing behind his steady gaze. He leaned forward slightly, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the table. "Kids like him," he repeated, his voice soft, barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a sledgehammer crashing through concrete. "You mean black kids?" It wasn't a question, it was a blade, cutting straight to the heart of Harper's excuse. Harper's mouth opened, then closed, his lips pressing into a thin, pale line. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His silence screamed louder than any defense he could have mustered, and it damned him more than words ever could. Sarah snapped the folder shut with a sharp, decisive crack, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense room. "Officer Harper," she said, her voice slicing through the charged atmosphere like a knife through butter, "your actions didn't just violate department policy. They trampled all over school rules and basic human decency, too. This isn't a simple case of misconduct, it's a glaring abuse of power, plain and simple." Her words were a condemnation, each one landing with the force of a judge's gavel. Harper's face darkened further, his hands curling into tight fists on the table, the knuckles whitening as he fought to hold onto whatever scraps of dignity he had left. "This is a setup," he muttered, his voice rising, cracking with desperation. "You're all out to get me because I'm not afraid to do my job." The accusation burst out of him, wild and unhinged, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an ally in the sea of stony faces. David rose to his feet, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the worn linoleum floor. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His presence alone filled the space, a towering figure of quiet strength that silenced Harper's outburst as effectively as a hand clamping over his mouth. "Your job," David said, his tone low and steady, each word deliberate, "is to protect and serve. Not to harass, not to intimidate, not to humiliate a child in front of his friends, his classmates, his world." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Harper, who seemed to shrink beneath it. "You didn't just fail at your job, Harper. You disgraced it. You took the trust people put in that uniform and twisted it into something ugly." The room was deathly quiet now, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Even the officers, who might have once nodded along with Harper's grumbling in the break room, sat still, their eyes downcast, their shoulders hunched as David's words stripped away any illusions they might have clung to. He turned to Sarah, his movements slow but purposeful, the fire in his eyes dimming just enough to let his exhaustion peek through. "What are the next steps?" he asked, his voice steady, but laced with a weariness that only those closest to him would recognize. Sarah straightened, her professionalism snapping back into place like a shield. "Officer Harper will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Pending a formal review. And given the evidence statements, the footage, the sheer weight of what we've seen, he expect that review will end in his termination." Her words were clinical, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, a quiet nod to the justice she knew was coming. Harper shot up from his chair, the sudden motion sending it toppling backward with a loud clatter that made a few officers flinch. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation now, cracking like dry timber underfoot. "You're only doing this because he's your kid. If it were anyone else, this wouldn't even be a blip on your radar." His chest heaved, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts as he glared at David, defiance and fear warring in his wild eyes. David took a single step closer, closing the distance between them, his calm demeanor unshaken, but his voice dropping to a deadly serious timbre. "If it were anyone else's child," he said, each word slow and deliberate, "I'd still be standing right here, because no child mine or anyone's deserves what you did to my son." Harper opened his mouth to argue, his face twisting with a mix of rage and panic. But before he could get a word out, the heavy conference room door swung open with a groan. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their boots thudding against the floor, their faces blank but resolute. "Officer Harper," one of them said, his voice flat and professional, "you need to come with us." Harper's head whipped around, his gaze darting from face to face, searching for Semyoni and Yodo Stepan, to back him up, to pull him out of the hole he dug himself into. But the room remained still, a gallery of silent witnesses to his downfall. His protests dwindled to a low mutter, then faded entirely as the officers flanked him, their hands firm but not rough as they guided him toward the door. He cast one last, frantic glance over his shoulder, but no one met his eyes. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound reverberating in the hollow silence that followed. David stood motionless, his broad frame rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the door long after Harper's footsteps had faded down the hall. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a shroud. Finally, he turned back to the group, his voice steady, but thick with emotion he could no longer fully suppress. "This isn't just about one officer," he said, his words carrying a quiet urgency. "It's about all of us. We have to do better for our community, for our kids, for ourselves. We can't let this be the standard. We can't let power turn into a weapon against the people we're sworn to protect." He lowered himself back into his chair, the tension in the room easing slightly. But the gravity of the moment lingered, heavy and unshakable. This wasn't the end of the reckoning, it was only the beginning. The officers around the table shifted uneasily, their chairs creaking as they adjusted their positions. Some met David's gaze with a flicker of respect, their eyes reflecting a newfound understanding of the man who led them. Others stared at the table, their fingers tracing invisible patterns on its surface, discomfort etched into the lines of their faces. A few avoided looking at him altogether, their heads bowed as if the weight of his words pressed physically against them. Sarah broke the silence, her voice cutting through the unease with its usual steadiness, though a thread of urgency wove through it now. "Chief Washington," she said, "with Harper gone, we'll need to prepare a public statement. This case is already buzzing out there, parents, the press, the community, and it's only going to get louder." David nodded slowly, his fingers interlacing on the table, the calluses on his hands catching the light. "We'll address it," he said, his voice measured but resolute. "But it's not just about words. It's about action. The people in this city need to see that we mean it when we talk about accountability, that we're willing to dig out the rot in our own ranks, no matter how deep it goes." His eyes scanned the room, taking in every face, every subtle reaction. A younger officer, a rookie with close-cropped hair and nervous hands, cleared his throat, the sound tentative in the heavy air. "Chief, if I may," he said, his voice wavering slightly, "I think what you did was right, but not everyone's going to agree. I've heard some of the guys talking. They think Harper was just doing his job, that this sets a bad precedent." David's eyes narrowed, a flicker of frustration tightening his jaw as he leaned forward. "A bad precedent," he repeated, his tone calm but edged with steel. "You think holding someone accountable for abusing their power is a bad precedent?" The young officer flinched, his hands twisting together under the table, but he pressed on, his voice small but earnest. "No, sir, I don't think that. I've heard the whispers, and I thought you should know." David sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of years spent fighting battles like this one. "Whispers are how these problems grow," he said, his gaze sweeping the room again. "If anyone in this department thinks what Harper did was okay, they're not just wrong, they are part of the problem. And I'll root them out, too." Sarah jumped in, her tone brisk but supportive, her hands resting lightly on the folder in front of her. "Chief, you're right. This department needs to know there's no room for behavior like Harper's zero tolerance. But how we frame this matters. If we present it as a chance to rebuild trust with the community, we might head off some of the blowback." David nodded again, a faint flicker of appreciation softening his features, though the turmoil inside him churned on, relentless and raw. "You're right," he said. "This isn't just about punishment. It's about change, real, lasting change." The meeting wrapped up soon after, the officers filing out one by one, their footsteps muffled against the linoleum, their murmurs trailing behind them like faint echoes. Sarah lingered, closing her folder with a quiet snap and turning to David, her expression softening as the room emptied. "You handled that well, Chief," she said, her voice gentler now, almost tender. "But I know this cuts deep for you. Are you okay?" David exhaled, long and slow, leaning back in his chair as the facade he'd held up for hours began to crack. "No, Sarah, I'm not okay," he admitted, his voice rough with the emotion he'd kept at bay. "My son was humiliated, terrorized, by someone who was supposed to keep him safe. And I have to sit here, day after day, pretending it's just business as usual. It's not." Sarah's eyes softened further, a quiet understanding passing between them. "You're doing the right thing," she said, her tone steady but warm. "Don't lose sight of that. And don't forget to look after yourself, too. Marcus needs Yano more than ever." David's throat tightened at the mention of his son's name, a lump forming that he couldn't quite swallow. "He's strong," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "but this has changed him. I see it when he looks at me, those questions in his eyes, that doubt. He's too young to be asking why the world works this way." Sarah stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but grounding. "And because of you," she said, "he'll see that justice isn't just a word. He'll see that fighting for it matters, that it's worth it." David didn't respond, but her words lingered, sinking into the cracks of his resolve as he stared at the empty doorway. Inside, his mind was a whirlwind, pride in his son's resilience, fury at Harper's betrayal, and a bone-deep determination to make things right. This wasn't just about one incident, one officer, one child. It was about the lesson etched into every moment of that day, that power, unchecked, corrodes everything it touches, and that justice, though hard won, is the only thing that can mend what's broken. As the silence stretched on, David knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew he wouldn't walk it alone. David slipped out of the room, his footsteps echoing faintly in the empty hallway as he made his way to the car. The drive home stretched out before him, a silent expanse of asphalt bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. The city's lights smeared into a hazy blur beyond the windshield, their colors bleeding together like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. His mind, though, was far from calm. It churned relentlessly, replaying the chaotic whirlwind of the past week. Each memory felt like a heavy stone piling onto his chest, and by the time he eased the car into the driveway, the burden had grown so immense it threatened to crush him entirely. Inside the house, the kitchen was a soft island of light in the otherwise darkened home. Marcus sat hunched over the table, his small frame dwarfed by the sprawl of his open notebook. The pencil in his hand hovered motionless above the page, as if he'd forgotten what he meant to write. He looked up as David stepped through the doorway, his young face shadowed with a wariness that made David's stomach twist. "Hey, Dad," Marcus murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, fragile and tentative, like he wasn't sure how it would be received. David set his bag down with a quiet thud and crossed the room, his hand finding Marcus's tousled hair. He ruffled it gently, the familiar gesture carrying a tenderness he hoped his son could still feel. "Hey, buddy," he replied, his tone warm but laced with exhaustion. "How was school today?" Marcus gave a half-hearted shrug, his eyes dropping back to the notebook, where faint pencil scratches marked his distracted thoughts. "It was okay, I guess," he said, his words flat. "People keep asking me about what happened." Pulling out a chair, David settled across from him, the wooden seat creaking under his weight. His heart clenched at the sight of Marcus's downturned face, the way his son's shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible load. "What do you tell them?" David asked, his voice soft but deliberate, probing gently into the storm he knew was brewing inside Marcus. The boy hesitated, his fingers tightening around the pencil. When he finally looked up, his eyes shimmered with a raw mix of frustration and sorrow. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't want to talk about it, but they won't stop. Some kids think it's cool that you're the chief of police and that you stood up to that officer. But others, they act like I'm the one who did something wrong." David's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger sparking deep within him, but he forced it down, keeping his expression steady for Marcus's sake. "Listen to me," he said firmly, leaning forward. "You didn't do anything wrong. Not a single thing. What happened, that it wasn't your fault. It was Harper's, and I'm making damn sure he faces the consequences." Marcus nodded slowly, but the doubt lingered in his gaze, a quiet uncertainty that gnawed at David's resolve. "What if nothing changes, Dad?" Marcus asked, his voice small but piercing. "What if people like him just keep doing stuff like that?" Reaching across the table, David rested a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder, feeling the slight tremble beneath his touch. "Things will change, son," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "It's not quick, and it's sure as hell not easy, but it's worth fighting for. And you've already helped make that happen. Just by holding your head up, by being the strong, good kid you are, you're pushing things forward. You're making a difference." Marcus's lips twitched into a faint, hesitant smile, a fragile spark of hope breaking through the gloom. "You really think so?" he asked, searching his father's face. David's own smile was warm, unwavering. "I know so," he said, pouring every ounce of belief he had into those words. For a fleeting moment, the weight between them seemed to lift until the sharp buzz of David's phone shattered the quiet. It vibrated insistently against the counter, pulling him back to reality. He stood, glancing at the screen, and his expression darkened as he recognized the number. "I need to take this," he said, stepping into the shadowed living room. The voice on the other end was Sarah's, clipped and urgent. "Chief, we've got a problem," she said. "Wasting no time. Harper's been running his mouth. He's stirring up trouble, saying this whole thing's a setup." David closed his eyes, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles whitened. "Let him talk," he said, his voice low and steely. "The evidence doesn't lie." Sarah's tone softened slightly, but the tension remained. "I figured you'd say that, but heads up, people are listening. Some are starting to take his side." A surge of frustration roared through David, hot and fierce. But he wrestled it back. "Let them," he replied, his words edged with defiance. "We're not backing down." He ended the call with a sharp tap, standing motionless in the dim room for a moment, letting the resolve settle deep into his bones. When he returned to the kitchen, Marcus's eyes flicked up, a silent question shimmering in them. David offered a reassuring smile and sank back into his chair. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, his voice tentative, as if bracing for bad news. David nodded, keeping his tone steady. "Yeah, buddy, everything's going to be okay." But beneath the surface, he felt the truth gnawing at him. Toughest battles were still looming on the horizon. The days after Harper's removal unfurled like a storm rolling over the city, thick with tension and unpredictability. Word of the incident at Jefferson Middle School had spiraled outward, spilling beyond the city limits to ignite local news broadcasts and fuel heated debates across social media. Every headline, every comment thread seemed to circle the same haunting question: was this a lone act of bias, or the festering symptom of a deeper rot? For David Washington, the answer burned clear as day, but persuading others felt like shouting into a gale. At home, Marcus was a shadow of his former self. The boy who once bounded through the house with boundless energy now moved with a cautious stillness that broke David's heart anew each day. Marcus had always been tough, a kid who could shrug off scraped knees and playground squabbles with a grin. But this had cracked something fundamental inside him. It wasn't just the sting of humiliation or the cold grip of fear. It was the dawning realization that the world wasn't the fair, orderly place he'd been raised to believe in. David noticed the small tells, the way Marcus flinched at a slammed door, the way he ducked his gaze when strangers pried too close. His son was hauling a burden no child should ever know, and it stoked a slow, smoldering fury in David's chest. Meanwhile, the precinct buzzed with its own unrest. Harper's actions had fractured the once tight ranks, splintering loyalties among the officers David had led for years. Some stood firmly behind him, praising his unflinching pursuit of justice and accountability. Others, though, muttered in shadowed corners, their whispers sharp with resentment. They questioned his judgment, accused him of letting personal stakes blur his duty. David was no stranger to pressure, had weathered scrutiny before, but this dissent cut deeper, its venom more personal, seeping into the department's spirit like a toxin. One afternoon, as he strode through the precinct's bustling corridors, a snatch of conversation stopped him cold. Near the break room, a cluster of officers huddled, their voices low but biting. "He's making us look weak," one growled, his tone thick with contempt. Harper might have been a hard-ass, but he didn't deserve to be thrown to the wolves like that. Another chimed in, quieter but no less bitter. "The chief's only going this hard because it was his kid. Anyone else, and he'd have let it slide." David's pulse quickened, but he steadied himself with a deep breath and stepped into the room. The chatter died instantly, the officers freezing mid-sentence, their faces a mix of guilt and defiance. "Something you want to say to my face?" David asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. The first officer faltered, then shook his head. "No, Chief. Just talking." David's gaze swept over them, locking eyes with each in turn. "Good," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Because if I ever catch wind of anyone here defending what Harper did, you'll be out the door before your coffee's cold. Clear?" They nodded, reluctant, their eyes dropping to the floor. Satisfied, David turned and walked away, but the encounter clung to him like damp fog. The rift in his team was widening, and though he couldn't falter, not with so much at stake, the weight of it pressed harder. That evening, David sat alone at the kitchen table, the house silent save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Case files and statements sprawled before him, a grim mosaic of Harper's misdeeds. The evidence was ironcladding in its clarity, but David knew it wouldn't sway everyone. The city teetered on a knife's edge, protests sprouting like weeds on both sides. Some rallied behind him, their voices loud with demands for reform. for a system scrubbed clean of corruption. Others hoisted Harper up as a martyr, painting David as a traitor to his own. The knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts unexpected, late, and jarring. Rising, he crossed the room, his pulse ticking up as he opened the door to find Sarah James standing there. Her face was taut, her posture rigid with urgency. "Sarah," he said, stepping aside. "What's going on?" She thrust a folder into his hands, her jaw clenched. "You need to see this. It's about Harper." David flipped it open, his eyes racing over the pages. Each line hit like a punch: complaints stretching back years, buried or dismissed, excessive force, racial profiling, falsified reports, a pattern of abuse so blatant it stole his breath. This is systemic," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "How the hell did he stay on this long?" Sarah crossed her arms, her expression grim. "Because no one wanted the mess. Complaints got filed, then buried. Victims gave up, or someone higher up made them disappear." David's mind reeled, the folder trembling slightly in his hands. This wasn't just about Harper anymore. It was a glaring lesson in justice denied, in the corrosive cost of unchecked power. And as the city's unrest swelled, he knew the fight ahead would test not just his resolve, but the very soul of the community he'd vowed to protect. David's fingers tightened around the edges of the folder, the crisp paper crinkling faintly under his grip as he snapped it shut. His jaw locked, a muscle twitching beneath the skin, as a storm of determination churned in his chest. For too long, he'd wrestled with the weight of indecision, but now the path ahead glowed with stark clarity. This wasn't just about one man's misdeeds anymore. It was about the soul of the department he'd sworn to uphold. "Not anymore," he muttered under his breath, the words sharp and final. "This ends now." Across the desk, Sarah shifted in her chair, her fingers pausing over the notepad she'd been scribbling on. Her hazel eyes flicked up to meet his, hesitation flickering in their depths like shadows on water. She drew a slow breath, choosing her words with the care of someone stepping through a minefield. "David," she began, her voice soft but steady, "you need to brace yourself. If this breaks wide open, it won't just be Harper in the crosshairs. The spotlight's going to swing onto all of USI included." Her brow furrowed, a silent plea woven into her expression. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" David's gaze didn't waver. His dark eyes burned with a resolve that felt almost tangible, a fire stoked by years of watching the system bend under the weight of its own flaws. "If that's what it takes to set things right, Sarah, then I'll stand in the flames myself," he said, his voice low but unshakable. "We can't keep patching up the cracks and pretending everything's fine. Not anymore." The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky outside the precinct windows streaked with clouds that mirrored the tension brewing within. David stood at the head of the conference room, his broad shoulders squared as he faced the department's leadership team. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as eyes darted between him and the file he'd laid bare on the table. Harper's file, a Pandora's box of corruption and abuse that could no longer be ignored. His voice cut through the silence, steady and deliberate, as he outlined the evidence: falsified reports, intimidation, power wielded like a blunt weapon against the very people they'd sworn to protect. Then came the plan's stricter oversight, mandatory reviews, a zero-tolerance stance that would reshape the department from the ground up. Faces around the table shifted through a spectrum of emotions. Some nodded, their lips pressed into thin lines of reluctant agreement, while others leaned back, arms crossed, their postures radiating defiance. Among them sat Daniels, a senior officer with graying temples and a voice that carried the weight of decades on the force. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his sharp blue eyes locking onto David's. "Chief," he said, his tone measured but edged with unease, "I admire what you're aiming for here. I do. But you've got to see what this'll do. You push this through, and it's not just Harper who'll bleed. This whole department could fracture. You'll lose the rank and file, the ones who've got your back out there. Are you really ready to gamble their loyalty for this?" The room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes trained on David. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he replied, the word ringing out like a hammer striking steel. "Because if we can't look ourselves in the mirror and demand better, if we can't hold our own accountable, then what right do we have to wear this badge?" This isn't about loyalty to me. It's about loyalty to what we stand for. We've drifted too far from that, Daniels, and it stops today." Silence swallowed the room, heavy and profound. Daniels held David's stare for a long, tense moment, his weathered face a map of conflicting thoughts, respect warring with doubt, frustration tangling with resignation. Finally, he gave a slow, grudging nod. "All right, Chief," he said, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "But you'd better steel yourself for what's coming. This isn't going to be clean." David felt the weight of those words settle into his bones as he left the meeting, his footsteps echoing down the precinct's tiled hallway. Resolve pulsed through him, a steady drumbeat that drowned out the exhaustion tugging at his edges. The road ahead loomed like a mountain shrouded in mist, daunting, treacherous, but unavoidable. He couldn't turn back now, not when he'd seen the rot festering beneath the surface, not when he knew what was at stake. At home, the dim glow of the kitchen light cast soft shadows across the table where Marcus waited, his small frame hunched over a half-eaten plate of spaghetti. His brown eyes, so much like his father's, lifted as David stepped through the door, searching for answers in the lines of his face. "How'd it go?" Marcus asked, his voice tentative, threaded with a worry he couldn't quite hide. David managed a faint smile, reaching out to tussle his son's dark curls, a gesture meant to reassure them both. "It's going to be rough, kid," he admitted, sinking into the chair across from Marcus. "But we're moving forward, step by step." The honesty felt raw, but he'd never been one to shield Marcus from the truth, not when it mattered. Marcus hesitated, his fork stilling against the plate. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, he slid out of his seat and wrapped his arms around David, the hug fierce and unyielding. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he whispered, his voice muffled against David's shoulder. Those words landed like a lifeline, pulling David back from the brink of doubt. They were a reminder of why he'd started this fight, why he couldn't let the shadows win out for himself, not for Marcus, not for the city depending on him. As he held his son close, a fragile spark of hope flickered to life, fragile but real. In the days that followed, the city seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. David's announcement of sweeping reforms rippled through the streets, igniting a storm of reactions. On bustling corners, voices clashed, some lifted in cautious hope, others sharpened with defiance. News vans lined up outside the precinct, their cameras hungry for every angle of the story. Headlines painted David in stark contrasts, a crusader for justice to some, a traitor unraveling his own ranks to others. Outside City Hall, protesters gathered in droves, their signs swaying in the brisk march, Winsome scrawled with praise like "Stand tall, Chief," while others bore venomous demands, "Resign now." At home, the sanctuary David once found in quiet evenings with Marcus began to fray. The boy was trying to be strong, his chin lifted in a mimicry of his father's resolve. But David could see the cracks beneath the surface. One night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Marcus set his fork down with a soft clink and fixed David with a look that carried far too much weight for a 12-year-old. "Dad," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty, "do you think the other officers hate you now?" The question sliced through David like a blade, catching him off guard. He set his glass down slowly, the condensation cool against his palm, and took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Why do you ask that, Marcus?" he said gently, though his heart thudded in his chest. Marcus shrugged, but his eyes stayed locked on his father's, unwavering. "I hear stuff at school. On TV, people are saying you're making enemies, that you're putting yourself in danger. Are they right?" His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his plate, betraying the fear he was trying so hard to bury. David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his voice calm but firm. "Marcus, listen to me. Doing what's right doesn't always win you friends. Sometimes it rattles people, especially when it means shaking up what they're used to. But that's no reason to back down. We stand up for what matters, even when it's tough, especially then." He paused, seeing the worry still clouding his son's gaze. "And if you're asking whether I'm scared, sure, sometimes. But courage isn't about not feeling fear, it's about pushing through it because you know it's worth it." Marcus nodded slowly, his lips pressing into a tight line, but the shadows in his eyes lingered. "What if they come after you, though?" he pressed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. What if they try to hurt you because of this? David's chest tightened, a pang of protectiveness surging through him. He reached across the table, resting a steady hand on Marcus's smaller one. Then I'll handle it, he said, his tone unwavering. I'm not afraid, Marcus, not of them, not of this. I'm doing this so you can grow up in a world where people like us don't let power twist into something ugly. We're going to be okay, I promise you that. That night, after Marcus had climbed into bed, David sat alone in the living room. The TV flickering with muted news reports he couldn't bring himself to focus on. His phone buzzed against the coffee table, Sarah's name lighting up the screen. He answered, his voice rough with fatigue. What's going on? Sarah's tone was taut, laced with urgency. David, we've got trouble. There's a group of officers meeting off horse quietly, but not quietly enough. They're pissed, and they're not hiding it. Word is they're gunning to force you out. David rubbed his temples, a dull ache blooming behind his eyes. Let me guess, Harper's stirring the pot? Of course he is, Sarah replied, her frustration palpable. He's playing the martyr card, spinning this like he's the one wronged, and he's got Taker Shino to make waves. How many? David asked, his grip on the phone tightening. Not most, Sarah said quickly, as if to soften the blow. But enough to be a problem, David. This isn't just about your job anymore, it's about your safety. You need to watch yourself. I'm not backing down, Sarah, he said, his voice hardening. They can come at me all they want, but I'm seeing this through. We're fixing this mess, no matter what it takes. Sarah sighed, a sound heavy with both admiration and exasperation. I knew you'd say that. Just promise me you'll be careful. You've got support, others, but you've got enemies now too. Don't underestimate them. I won't, David assured her, though as he hung up, a chill settled over him. He'd expected pushback, but the thought of his own officers turning against him gnawed at him a betrayal. That cut deeper than he'd anticipated. He sat in the dark, the hum of the city filtering through the walls, and let his mind wrestle with the battles ahead. The next day, the precinct felt like a different world. The usual buzz of conversation died as David walked through, replaced by a frigid silence. Eyes darted away from his, heads turned just a little too quickly. He kept his posture straight, his expression unyielding, refusing to let the hostility crack him. That afternoon, he had a meeting with Mayor Caldwell, a man whose firm handshake and guarded smile betrayed nothing of his thoughts. The mayor's office was all polished wood and muted light, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his voice smooth but neutral. Chief Washington, you've kicked up quite a storm. I've been watching it unfold, and I'll be honest, you've got my attention. David met his gaze, unflinching. Change always stirs things up, Mayor, but it's long overdue. Caldwell nodded, his expression inscrutable. I don't dispute that. Harper crossed lines that can't be uncrossed, and you were right to call him out. But you've unsettled a lot of people inside your ranks and out on the streets. I need to know you've got a handle on this. I do, David said, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the desk. First, we go transparent, let the public see we're not dodging this, that we're facing it head on. Second, accountability just for Harper, but for anyone who thinks they can wield power like a club and walk away clean. Third, we rebuild trust with the officers, with the city. It's a hard road, but it's the only one that leads anywhere worth going. The mayor listened, his face a mask of careful consideration. When David finished, Caldwell tilted his head, his tone cautious but not dismissive. It's a solid plan. Chief, ambitious as hell, though. You're asking people to rethink everything they've known about this department. That's not a small lift. David's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of defiance flaring. Maybe not. But justice isn't about what's easy, it's about what's necessary. And the consequence of letting power run unchecked, that's a price we've paid too long already. Caldwell studied him for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod, a faint glimmer of respect breaking through his reserve. All right, David, you've got my backing for now, but you'd better deliver. As David left the office, the weight of the mayor's words mingled with the lessons etched into his core. Justice demanded sacrifice, and unchecked power bred ruin. He'd fight for both truths, no matter the cost. David stood in the mayor's office, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the heavy blinds, casting long, jagged shadows across the polished wooden floor. His heart thudded steadily in his chest, a rhythm of resolve that had carried him through countless sleepless nights. He'd just laid bare his plan, a bold, unyielding push to root out corruption within the police department he now led. The words still hung in the air, heavy with conviction. The way they think, the way they operate's not something that shifts in a single day. I know that. But change has to begin somewhere, and I'm ready to pour everything I have into making it happen. His voice had been steady, but beneath it churned a storm of doubt, hope, and an unshakable sense of duty. The mayor, a man whose lined face bore the weariness of years spent navigating the city's tangled politics, regarded David with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. For a long, agonizing moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint hum of traffic beyond the window. Then, slowly, the mayor extended his hand across the desk, his fingers trembling slightly not from fear, David realized, but from the gravity of what he was agreeing to. "All right, Chief," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You've got my backing. But hear me loud and clear. If this spins out of control, if the chaos gets too big to contain, I'll have no choice but to step in and pull the plug. I hope to God it doesn't come to that." David clasped the mayor's hand, his grip firm and unyielding, a silent promise etched into the gesture. "It won't," he said, the words carrying more certainty than he truly felt. "Thank you, Mayor." As he turned to leave, the air in the room seemed to lighten, as if the agreement had lifted some invisible burden from his shoulders. Stepping out into the hallway, he felt a spark ignite deep within him, a renewed fire that burned brighter than ever. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, a twisting road lined with unseen obstacles. But for the first time in months, he knew he wasn't facing it alone. His thoughts drifted to Marcus, his son, whose wide, trusting eyes had once looked to him for answers David couldn't always provide. The promise he'd made to Marcus to fight for a world where justice wasn't just a word was the anchor. That kept him steady, no matter the cost. He'd see this through. That evening, as David strode back into the precinct, the mayor's warning echoed in his mind like a distant drumbeat. The support was a lifeline, a fragile thread of trust, but it came laced with a threat. One wrong move, one crack in the facade of control, and everything he'd built could collapse. The stakes loomed larger than ever, a towering shadow that followed his every step. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, every citizen, every officer, every critic waiting to see if he'd falter. The precinct buzzed with its usual hum of activity, but beneath the surface, a current of tension crackled like static. As he passed through the bullpen, a few officers offered quick nods, brief, respectful acknowledgments that felt more like habit than genuine support. Others kept their gazes fixed on their desks, their silence a deafening rebuke. David sensed the fractures within his team deepening, invisible fault lines threatening to split wide open. He stopped in front of the bulletin board, its surface cluttered with faded notices and hastily pinned announcements. For a fleeting moment, he let himself linger there, scanning the mundane updates as if they could anchor him in some semblance of normalcy. But the illusion shattered when a voice cut through the low murmur of the room. Sharp and deliberate. "He's turning this department into a damn circus," it muttered, just loud enough to reach David's ears. The words stung, a barb aimed with precision. He turned slowly, his movements measured, and locked eyes with Officer Daniel Sawiri, sharp-featured man whose defiance had simmered beneath the surface for weeks. Daniel stood by his desk, arms crossed, his posture rigid with challenge. He didn't flinch under David's stare, his hazel eyes glinting with a mix of resentment and bravado. "Got something you'd like to say to everyone, Officer Daniels?" David's voice was calm, but it carried a steel edge, a warning wrapped in quiet authority. The room seemed to hold its breath, the other officers pausing mid-task, their attention drawn to the brewing confrontation. Daniels straightened, his jaw tightening as he squared his shoulders. "With all due respect, Chief, I'm just giving voice to what plenty of us are thinking. This whole Harper mess, it's gone way too far. You're dragging this department through the dirt over one bad decision. Morale's in the gutter, and it's on you." His words were clipped, each one landing like a stone tossed into still water, rippling out to unsettle the room. David took a step closer, his voice dropping low. "Meant only for Daniels and the handful of officers within earshot. Morale's low because some of you think accountability's a choice you can opt out of. Because you'd rather shield your pride than protect the people we swore to serve. If that's what you believe this department's about, then maybe you're right, Mabe, you don't belong here." His gaze bore into Daniels, unflinching, a silent demand for the man to back down or double down. Daniels' jaw clenched, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he held his tongue. Round them, the other officers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two men. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken loyalties and simmering discontent. David didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked away, his shoulders squared against the weight of their stares. But the encounter left a sour taste in his mouth, a bitter reminder that the resistance within his own ranks was hardening. It was only a matter of time before it erupted into something he couldn't contain. Later that night, David sat alone at his desk, the precinct quiet save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Stacks of reports on the Harper investigation sprawled across the surface, their pages filled with damning details that grew uglier with every turn. The deeper they dug, the more rot they uncovered, complaints stretching back years, a trail of abuses that painted Harper as a man who'd thrived in the shadows of unchecked power. But what gnawed at David most was the creeping realization that others had known. Colleagues he'd trusted, officers he'd stood beside, he'd seen the signs and turned away, letting the poison fester. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Sarah, his deputy, standing in the threshold. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, accentuating the exhaustion etched into her features. In her hands, she clutched a thick folder, its edges worn from handling. She stepped inside without a word, setting it down on his desk with a soft thud. "More complaints," she said, her voice heavy with a weariness that mirrored his own. "It's like peeling back layers of decay. The deeper we go, the worse it stinks." David flipped open the file, his eyes scanning the fresh accusations with a grim frown. "How did this go on for so damn long?" he muttered, the question more a lament than a query, directed at the empty air as much as at Sarah. She sank into the chair across from him, her posture slumping slightly as if the weight of the truth pressed down on her. Because no one wanted to touch it. It's easier to look the other way, to tell yourself it's someone else's mess, to clean up until it's too late. And the stench is everywhere. Her tone was matter of fact, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of anger, a quiet fury at the cowardice that had let this fester. David shut the folder and leaned back, rubbing his temples as a dull ache pulsed behind his eyes. "This isn't just about Harper anymore," he said, his voice low and resolute. "It's about what this department's become. If we don't rip out the roots of this culture, it'll keep spreading, poisoning everything." Sarah nodded, her gaze drifting to the folder as if it held the ghosts of every failure they'd unearthed. "The real question is how you change something so deep-seated. It's not just rules and regulations, it's the way people think, the biases they cling to, the stories they tell themselves to sleep at night." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped tightly. "You start at the top. You show that no one's untouchable, that accountability isn't negotiable. And you prove that doing what's right doesn't mean abandoning the people who rely on us." His words were firm, a vow carved from the pain of every lesson he'd learned. Sarah studied him, her lips curving into a faint, tired smile. "You're not just fighting for Marcus, are you? You're fighting for all of them." Her voice softened, a rare crack in her usual stoicism. David's throat tightened, the mention of his son stirring a tide of emotion he rarely let surface. "Marcus was the one who made me see it," he admitted, his voice rough. "But this is bigger than him. It's for every kid who's been treated like they're invisible. Every parent who's had to teach their child how to survive a world that doesn't give a damn about their worth. If we can't fix this, then what the hell are we even doing here?" Sarah reached across the desk, her hand resting lightly on his. "You're on the right path, David. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Her touch was brief, a quiet gesture of solidarity, but it carried a warmth that steadied him. As she left, the silence settled back over the room, heavier than before. David stared at the closed door, the enormity of the fight ahead pressing down on him. The road was long, the obstacles towering, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. Justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a debt he owed to his son, to the city, to himself. And he'd pay it, no matter the toll. The next morning, an anonymous tip landed in his inbox. Its words stark and urgent. Harper and his loyalists were meeting off-site, a clandestine gathering in a dimly lit bar on the city's edge. It was a bold move, a signal they were rallying to undermine him. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he debated his next step. Confronting them head-on risked escalating the tension, but letting it fester felt like surrender. In the end, he couldn't ignore it. That evening, he drove through the quiet streets, the bar's neon sign flickering in the distance like a beacon of defiance. Stepping inside, the air hit him thick with cigarette smoke and the low rumble of conversation that hushed the moment he appeared. Heads turned, eyes narrowing as they took him in. Harper sat at a table near the back, flanked by a handful of officers whose faces David knew too well. His former ally's expression darkened, a storm cloud rolling over his features as David approached. "Chief," Harper drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "What brings you to our little get-together?" David ignored the bait, addressing the group with a calm that belied the fire in his chest. "I heard there's a discussion about this department's future. Figured I'd join in." His tone was even, but his presence filled the room, a quiet challenge to their whispered rebellion. Harper leaned back, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Not your kind of meeting, Chief. Just a few guys trying to figure out how to save this place from someone who's hell-bent on tearing it apart." David stepped closer, his voice steady but cutting. "If you want to save it, start by owning up to your own mess. Stop pointing fingers and face the consequences of what you've done. That's where real change begins." His words landed like a slap, stripping away Harper's bravado for a fleeting second. The smirk faded, replaced by a hard, dangerous glint in Harper's eyes. He rose to his feet, his frame tense, towering over the table. "You think you're some kind of savior, don't you? But all you're doing is splitting us apart. You're making enemies, Chief. That's not leadership." David didn't blink, meeting Harper's glare head-on. "Leadership isn't about winning a popularity contest. It's about standing for what's right, even when it's messy, even when it costs you. What you've done, what you've gotten away with this wrong. Twist it however you like, but the truth doesn't bend." The room fell silent, the air crackling with unspoken stakes. Harper's fists clenched at his sides, his breath shallow as he stared David down. "You think you're better than me," he hissed, his voice a low growl. "You think you're untouchable." "I think I'm willing to fight for what matters," David replied, unflinching. "And if that makes me your enemy, then so be it." The two men stood locked in that moment, the weight of their choices hanging between them, a clash of wills that spoke to the deeper battle for justice and the ruinous cost of power unchecked. The tension in the room hung thick and electric, a silent storm brewing between the two men as their unspoken challenges crackled in the air. Harper, his patience fraying, let out a sharp scoff that cut through the quiet like a blade. With an exaggerated roll of his eyes, he slumped back into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He flicked his hand toward David as if shooing away a pesky fly, his voice dripping with disdain. "All right, Chief, you've made your little point. Now get out." The dismissal was lazy, almost theatrical, but it carried the sting of a man who'd grown to comfortable wielding power without question. David didn't budge at first. His feet stayed planted on the worn hardwood floor, his broad shoulders squared as his dark eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, some curious, some hostile, all waiting to see what he'd do next. The weight of their stares pressed against him, but he refused to flinch. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, he strode toward the door, his boots echoing against the floorboards. When he pulled it shut behind him, the heavy thud reverberated like a gavel striking wood, a sound that lingered in his mind as he climbed into his truck and started the long drive home. The road stretched out before him, shadowed by the dim glow of streetlights, and as the city faded into the rearview mirror, his thoughts churned. This fight was far from over, knew that in his bones, but retreat wasn't an option, not with so much hanging in the balance. His son Marcus, the integrity of the department he'd sworn to lead, and the fragile hope for a future where justice wasn't just a word thrown around in speeches. Days later, the courtroom buzzed with restless energy. A hive of anticipation packed to the brim with bodies. Every rickety wooden bench was occupied, and those who couldn't find a seat pressed themselves against the peeling walls, their murmurs blending into a low hum that vibrated through the space. The air was stale, thick with the scent of sweat and old paper, as people craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the drama unfolding. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning for a city rattled to its foundations. When the judge swept in, her black robe billowing slightly with each purposeful step, the chatter died instantly. Her face was a mask of stern resolve, her presence a quiet command that demanded order without a single word. David Washington sat near the front, his spine rigid against the hard bench, though his hands betrayed him clenched so tightly his knuckles paled. Beside him sat Marcus, his teenage son, who'd insisted on being there despite the storm of emotions swirling beneath his calm exterior. The boy's face was a study in quiet strength, but David could see the flicker of nerves in the way his fingers twitched against his jeans. He knew what it cost Marcus to be here, to sit under the harsh fluorescent lights and face the echoes of his pain head-on. Across the room, at the defense table, Greg Harper slumped in his chair, a shadow of the man he'd once been. The cocky swagger that had defined him for years had eroded, worn away by weeks of scrutiny and the slow drip of damning evidence. Now, bitterness clung to him like a second skin, his lips pressed into a thin, resentful line. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgent, but Harper barely tilted his head, his response a faint grunt. His eyes, cold and unyielding, stayed locked on the judge, though every so often they darted toward David and Marcus, his jaw tightening as if the sight of them burned. The trial had been a brutal slog day, after day of witnesses peeling back the layers of Harper's corruption. Some took the stand with hesitation, their voices low and halting as they unearthed buried secrets. Others spoke with fire, their anger spilling out in sharp, clipped sentences as they recounted years of abuse brushed under the rug. And then there was Marcus. When he'd testified, his voice had been steady, a thread of steel running through it despite the faint tremble in his hands. He'd spoken of the fear that had coiled in his chest, the humiliation that had seared his pride, and the questions that still gnawed at him in the quiet of night. When he finished, a profound silence had blanketed the room, his words sinking into the crowd like stones into still water, leaving ripples of unease and awe. Now, the moment of truth had arrived. The judge surveyed the room, her gaze steady and inscrutable, before her voice cut through the tension. After careful review of the evidence and consideration of the testimonies provided, this court finds the defendant, Greg Harper, guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and falsifying reports. Sentencing will be determined at a later date, but let this be unequivocal: justice must prevail. A ripple of gasps and whispers surged through the crowd, but David remained still, his breath caught in his chest. He stole a glance at Marcus, who stared straight ahead, his expression a complex tapestry of relief and something softer, something that hinted at the first fragile steps toward healing. David's hand found his son's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze, and Marcus turned to him at last. A small, tentative smile broke through the boy's guarded demeanor, a flicker of light piercing the gloom that had shadowed them for so long. As the courtroom began to empty, Harper was escorted out, his wrists bound in cold steel cuffs. He didn't spare a glance for David or Marcus as he shuffled past, but the slump of his shoulders and the drag of his steps told a story of their own a man undone, his empire of arrogance reduced to rubble. For years, he'd operated as if the rules didn't apply to him, his power a shield against consequence. But now, that shield had shattered, and justice long delayed, fiercely fought for, had finally closed its grip around him. The lesson was stark and undeniable. Unchecked power breeds corruption, and no one, no matter how untouchable they seem, can escape its reckoning forever. Outside, the air was sharp and cool, a brisk wind tugging at their coats as they descended the courthouse steps. The sun blazed overhead, casting golden light across the stone facade as if to herald the end of a tempest. Reporters swarmed like bees, their voices a chaotic chorus of shouted questions, microphones thrusting forward. David stepped in front of Marcus, shielding him from the frenzy, his jaw set as he waved them off. No comment. he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. This wasn't about feeding the media machine or crafting a headline. It was about him and his son reclaiming a piece of themselves, finding a sliver of peace amid the wreckage. That evening, their small kitchen felt transformed, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in weeks. The scent of garlic and onions sizzling in a pan mingled with the faint hum of Marcus, sketching at the table, his pencil scratching softly against the paper. David moved between the stove and the counter, the clatter of plates and the hiss of oil a comforting rhythm. Marcus's voice broke the quiet, tentative but curious. "Dad, do you think things will really change, like, for other kids like me?" David paused, wiping his hands on a faded dish towel as he turned to face his son. The question hung between them, heavy with hope and doubt. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Marcus," he said, his voice warm but measured. "It's slow, messy work. But what you did, it's a spark. And sometimes, a spark is all it takes to light something bigger." Marcus nodded, his brow furrowing slightly as he mulled it over, then returned to his drawing. For the first time in ages, he seemed unburdened, as if the invisible chains he'd carried had finally loosened their hold. The department, too, was shifting beneath David's steady hand. His push for reform had met fierce resistance, grumbled complaints in break rooms, icy stares in hallways, but the trial had drawn a line in the sand. Harper's allies faced their own consequences. Some were disciplined, others quietly slipped away, their resignations a tacit admission of defeat. Those who stayed began to see the cracks in the old ways, the necessity of the accountability David demanded. It wasn't a perfect transformation, pros rarely wasped, it was a start. A foundation laid brick by painstaking brick. Months later, at a community gathering, David stood on a makeshift stage, the late afternoon sun painting the crowd in hues of gold. Families, students, and city officials stretched out before him, their faces a mix of curiosity and pride. Marcus stood at his side, clutching a polished wooden plaque engraved with words of recognition for David's leadership. As David spoke of accountability, of justice, of a future worth fighting for, his eyes drifted to his son. Marcus looked up at him, his expression glowing with quiet admiration, and David felt a swell of emotion tighten his chest. This wasn't just a victory for the city, it was theirs, a testament to the storms they'd weathered together. As the event wound down and the crowd thinned, Marcus tugged at David's sleeve, his voice soft but earnest. "Dad, you know how you always tell me to stand up for what's right, no matter what." David smiled, crouching slightly to meet his son's gaze. "Yeah, I do." Marcus's grin widened, his eyes sparking with light. "You're really good at it." The words hit David like a wave, warm and overwhelming, and he pulled Marcus into a tight embrace. The chatter of the dispersing crowd faded into the background, the world shrinking to just the two of them. Every battle, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, it had all led here, and it was worth it. They'd faced the darkness and emerged not just intact, but stronger, bound by a shared resilience and a hard-won hope. The story of David and Marcus is more than a tale of triumph, it's a mirror held up to the messy, vital pursuit of justice. It reminds us that power, when abused, leaves scars, but those scars can fuel a fight for something better. The consequences of Harper's downfall ripple outward, a warning to those who mistake authority for invincibility. For David, for Marcus, for every soul watching from the sidelines, it's a call to stand firm, to push forward, because even the smallest spark can ignite a fire that changes everything.